Welcome back to the shop. I'm calling this one a folk art inspired serving tray. That's code for it doesn't need to be perfect. This is a limited tool project, so no power saws required. And it's a fun project if you're just getting into woodworking or if you want to build a project with the kids. It also makes a nice holiday gift idea. I'll have a link to the materials and cut list right here and down in the description below. Now let's go ahead and get to work. The only power tool you'll need for this project is a drill. The rest are hand tools that you may already have. All of your materials you're going to get at the home store. This is described as 1/2 inch by 2.5. It comes in 24-inch lengths, and this is poplar, but you could also use maple. Poplar's a little bit softer, and this is a painted project, so poplar's a good choice. For your plywood, you can buy a small piece, and at Home Depot, you can have the piece cut to your size. You just want to make sure it's less than about 22 inches because you want to be able to frame the piece of plywood. This piece is 13 by 17, and I think that's a good size for a serving tray. So the saw that I'm going to use is a hand saw, but it's a pull saw, so it cuts on the pull, and I think that's easier to control than your typical Western saw, which cuts on the push. So if you're going to buy a saw, look for a pull saw. Might be described as a Japanese pull saw. And the first thing I'm going to do is make my shortcuts. So this would be my shortcut. I'm going to hold the piece of wood flush on one side and put a mark where I want the next cut to be, and that'll be flush with this side. I'm flush over here. Come over to the other side, and with a sharp pencil, make a mark, and then extend that line with a square. And I'm going to extend the line here as well, so I can see when I'm making the cut. I'll put the saw on the line, and as I pull it back, it will start to cut. Once you get it going, then it's easier. And I'll make the next shortcut. Make sure I'm flush on that side. Use the square to extend the mark. I'll put the pencil right on the mark, and that's an easy way to do it. Because this is going to be a serving tray, I want to drill a 1-inch finger hole on the short ends so it's easier to pick up. So I'm going to measure down 1 inch. Whoops, there we go. And the center would be 6.5. I'll do that on both. 1 inch, 6.5. And I'm going to clamp this board down when I drill the hole. This is a 1-inch paddle bit, and I'll go over all the tools that I used on this project at the end of the video. We'll see how that turned out. Pretty good. This is kind of a rustic project, kind of a folk art serving tray. So if I did have tear out, I could sand it. It wouldn't be the end of the world. But it's nice to avoid tear out. And one way to do that is to brace the hole as you're drilling it. So if I were drilling out here, as the bit went through, it would tear out the back side. But because the bit is cutting into this piece underneath, I get a cleaner cut. So if you have a piece of scrap wood, that's a good use for it. And that's pretty good too. I must have drilled the wrong hole though. Look at that. Remember I made 2 lines? This was the inch. This one is a little less. So my holes didn't line up. It's a good thing that I said this is going to be a rustic project. I'm going to stick with it and just keep moving along. Before I attach these parts to the 1/2 inch plywood, I'm setting the 1/2 inch plywood in 1/4 inch. So I'll make a mark at 1/4 inch on the sides of these pieces. Now I'll take the paddle bit out of the drill and replace it with a 1/16 inch bit. This is for pre-drilling the holes before I nail. I'll use just a little bit of wood glue and I'll put this piece on with those marks so the 1/2 inch plywood is set in 1/4 inch. I've got a clamp on there to help hold it in place, clamp on both sides. Since I set the back in 1/4 inch and I'm using 1/2 inch plywood, I'll measure up 1/2 inch and that'll put the nail in the center of that plywood. And to make sure it goes in and doesn't move around, I'll pre-drill first with a 1/16 inch drill bit. Pre-drilling makes all the difference. If I didn't do that, this piece could move around and then I wouldn't end up with this exact same reveal. You can now set these nails with a traditional nail set, but this is a spring set and I feel like I have more control. And that set that really nicely. Now I can flip it over and attach the other end. Set these nails again with this spring nail set. Now that I have the ends on, I can take my next long pieces and I'll put the tray. You can see it's starting to shape up here. Flush on the one side. And then, let me see if I got a sharper point on this one. This one's better. And put a nice sharp point on this side. And I'll extend that mark onto the edge. And make the cut. And I'll go ahead and mark out the other side because they should be the same. I'm not expecting these cuts to be perfect. It is, or I am describing this as a folk art serving tray. That's kind of to give me a bit of a pass on some of my cuts if they're not great. And I kind of like a rustic look. These are actually looking pretty good, but it is a nice saw. It's nice and new and sharp. And I've got a bit of experience using a handsaw. If you have a power saw, that'll make the project easier, but using a handsaw is fun. So I'm going to clamp this. That'll just keep this from shifting around, and then I'll pre-drill the holes again before nailing them. Something very satisfying about hammering a nail. All right, I've just got the one side left. Again, I'm using a little wood glue. And if I didn't mention, I'm just keeping the frame parts flush with each other when I put the long sides on. Clamping really helps. So I'll get this piece in place, and then the clamps keep everything from moving around while I'm pre-drilling and nailing. Yeah, this cut's not perfect. I'll show you how the cuts aren't perfect once it's built, so you realize not everything needs to be perfect. Oh, I think it turned out pretty good. It's not perfect, but pretty good. A little bit of a lip over here, but other than that, pretty nice, and everything can be sanded. Again, this doesn't need to be perfect. Now, if you'd like to see all the materials that I use to fill and paint the project so it turns out something like this, stick around and I'll get to that in a minute. But first, let me just go over all the tools that I used. There's not a lot, but there's a few. So you've got a combination square. You could also use a regular square. Of course, a hammer, a 1-inch paddle bit, the spring nail set. I really like this tool. It's very, very useful. The nails are 1.5 inches. These are, what are they called? These 4D finish nails. A drill, 1/16 of an inch drill bit. 2 clamps. These are always handy to have around anyway. Of course, a tape measure and some wood glue and a pull saw. Now, I bought this from my friend Chris at Third Coast Craftsman. You don't need to get this saw, but it does work nice. And I'll have a link to his channel down in the description below, and I'm sure he has a link to where you can find this saw. So let me go ahead and show you what I'm going to use to fill these holes, prime it, and then the paint that I'll use to paint the tray. Before I do any sanding, I'm going to fill the nail holes with joint compound. Any wood fill will do, but joint compound, also known as spackle, I usually have around, and it Works really good for painted projects. Just to show you that no one's perfect, when I nailed through this side, the nail came out over here. So I just simply set the nail again, and I'll fill that with a little of the wood fill, and that'll be good to go. I let the wood fill dry, and you can speed up the dry time with a hairdryer if you want. That's what I did. And now I'm going to sand the fill and the project at the same time. And because this is a rustic project, I don't mind if I round the corners over a bit. After sanding, I'm going to prime the tray. And this is Benjamin Moore's Fresh Start. It's an acrylic-based primer. I'll let the primer dry, sand the primer because the primer is going to raise the grain and give the finish a very rough feel. So I'll sand that first coat. Once it's dry, paint a second coat, and then that's it for the base. Once the second coat of primer is dry, I'll give the trays a light sanding. Sanding through the paint so some of the wood comes through. Kind of gives it that folk art, rustic look. And then the tray is ready for your artwork. I like to use stencils, and the paint that I use is Aura from Benjamin Moore. I buy it in the quart containers. And if you'd like to see a video on that whole process, making the stencils and painting the tray, maybe I can get that on the channel in the near future. I will be selling these trays on my website, and I'll have a link right here if you want to check that out. As always, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. If you're still here and you want to learn more about woodworking and maybe even build the furniture for your home, I hope that you'll check out my website and check out all of my project plans. I have a ton of furniture projects over there, and they all have free video tutorials right here on YouTube to help guide you through the project and answer any questions that may come up during the build. So I hope that you'll click on the link in the description or right here and let me help you with your next woodworking project. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week.